So we're going to be discussing this morning some of the sources relating to the sanctity of the synagogue. We're going to come at it in a little bit of a roundabout way, where there was a headline that appeared in the Jewish Week or the JTA. It's all kind of combined now in one Jewish media organization called 70 Faces. And the headline was, "Why Your Synagogue in Mine Needs a Pickleball Court." So the weekday minyan at my synagogue, source number one, has been moved from the sanctuary to its airy social hall. And whenever I attend, I have the same lofty thought. This would make a great pickleball court. Pickleball, the subject of countless breathless articles calling it the fastest growing sport in America, is essentially tennis for people with terrible knees. Players use hard paddles to knock a wiffle ball across a net on a court about a third as big as a tennis court. I dream of doing for synagogues and pickleball what Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, the founder of the Reconstructionist Judaism, did for shuls and pools. He popularized the notion of synagogue centers that would include prayer services, as well as adult ed, Hebrew schools, theater, athletics, and yes, swimming pools, hence the expression, the shul with a pool. Kaplan was the first to insist that the synagogue remain the hub from which other communal factions derive. Only then might the synagogue fulfill its true purpose, the fostering of Jewish community. Right, the Hebrew word for a synagogue is a Beit Knesset. Knesset has at its root the word Kenisa, which we're familiar for those who've been to Israel. Kenisa is the entrance, so it's meant to be a house of entrances. So Andrew Silo Carroll continues, "I shared with Rabbi Alex Lazarus Klein my obsession with the synagogue as a third place. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg's idea of public places that host the regular, voluntary, informal, and happily anticipated gatherings of individuals beyond the realms of home and work. Kaplan, I think, deserves the last word. The synagogue," he wrote in 1915, "should become a social center where the Jews of the neighborhood may find every possible opportunity to give expression to their social and play instincts. It must become the Jews' second home. It must become their club, their theater, and their forum. It must become, I know he would agree, a place for pickleball." So there's a lot in this article with regards to the current state of the synagogue. You can read the whole article on the JTA website with regards to some of the thinking about using the synagogue more often. Sometimes, especially these days, shuls are not generally filled on a day-to-day basis. Daily minyan does not draw what Shabbos minyan draws, which does not draw what holiday or Yizkor or high holiday services draw. So the whole idea of shuls have been taking on a different connotation. And now we, especially in this this emerging from pandemic culture, shuls have moved into people's backyards or living rooms, and we're kind of going full circle. And Kaplan, especially in his roles as rabbi of a number of prominent Manhattan synagogues, rabbi at Congregation Kilath Jeshurun, KJ on the Upper East Side, and then rabbi of the Jewish Center on the West Side, and then the Society for Advancement of Judaism, and when he went into his Reconstructionist phase, very much felt that the totality of a Jew's experiences could be had in the synagogue. And some of us are familiar with these various Jewish centers, like the one in Manhattan, like the Jewish Center of Atlantic Beach, gets the idea that shuls aren't only supposed to be for prayers, there are other purposes for gathering as well. Some very well-known shuls with pools that developed in Manhattan, where they had large structures. Kingsway Jewish Center in Brooklyn as another example. I'm sure our paths have crossed with other of these centers. The idea of having a shul provide other modes of expression. Right? Many of us immediately come to mind. We think about the social hall or the Beit Midrash that shuls have as well. And we're the idea of playing the idea of a pickleball court in a synagogue. Well, what about the sanctuary space itself? And we're going to be exploring the idea of the sanctity of the synagogue, where the sanctity of the synagogue comes from, and how that's meant to guide or control or regulate our behavior in it, as well as the fact that maybe this idea of a multi-purpose facility is not necessarily the classic synagogue, but an accommodation to the way Jewish society has developed over the centuries. Reactions or thoughts just after looking at the article? Anything about
Listen, Atlantic Beach, it wasn't an epiphany from Hashem that started that community. It was God's creation of the ocean, and then they worked around it.
Right. Look, the geographic locations of synagogues always, took somewhat of a concentration of people. That's one of the first things you have to build. And I think really it's this idea that the shul is for more than davening. Is something that can be explored, as well as thinking back, even going back to think of the fact that, and we see this in some of the research, some of the earliest synagogues, right? Some people here may have been to the synagogue at Ein Gedi, which they say goes back, certainly to at least the 6th century, if not earlier. There's usually spaces that are uncovered that were not just prayer spaces. And so this idea of what's the classic shul from a rabbinic perspective versus a social perspective, and how the two kind of maybe met, and then even how the two even veered, especially in the last several hundred years, is something that we're going to look at. Any pickleball aficionados here?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so I see that gets the biggest response.
Good morning,
Sure.
Rabbi.
Yes, good morning. I think we're gonna have to start a pickleball team.
I am a pickleball aficionado enthusiast. And I have to
Yes.
say, anything that a synagogue can do that brings people together, because, put a pizza knife in their hand. I don't care what it is to get them involved, but once you can get them into the building, then you get them hooked on the community. If it takes a paddle ball to do that or a pickleball to do it, then you've won the game. You've won the game.
It's well, and if 100, although rabbis don't like congregants to be armed, depending on what the sermons are going to be about. So maybe we'll keep the knives out of the synagogue. Although there's an interesting law in the Shulchan Aruch with regards to bringing swords into the synagogue, and how ideally, if you have them, they should be sheathed, and it just has to do with proper conduct, not about weapons. And the whole is viewed as something that's kind of anathema to the synagogue to have weaponry, but what about the need for security? That's a bit of a tangent. Maybe we'll circle back to that. But what Louise is saying, Hirsch just posted into the chat, Lech kenos et kol haYehudim, right? The from the book of Esther, right? It's a gathering. It's a gathering space. It's a portal. Look, Kinisa literally is an entrance. Maybe it's an entry point. It doesn't have to be a place that people are used to. So there's certainly a lot of utility and purpose and aspiration of the synagogue. And we're going to pivot to discuss, specifically this idea of the sanctity. We know that in Judaism, objects can acquire sanctity. I know everybody knows about this when they want to get rid of all the extra benchers they have in their house. Because, people, one of the most common questions that I get as a rabbi is does the shul dispose of shemus, right? Shemus is the appellation that we give to things which have God's name, the Shemot Hashem in them, and you have to dispose of them properly. And generally they're buried, and people want to do the right thing, so they get it to the shul. Over time, this has become a big business. There's some places that you have to pay like $40 a pound to dispose of shemus. So, but we all know that things acquire sanctity, and certain objects, this have greater sanctity, and there's a hierarchy of sanctity. And it seems that according to the Jewish tradition, according to Jewish law, the synagogue has sanctity. And just like all of us want to make sure that we dispose of our benchers properly, that same type of approach is one that we would take with is that we would take with a synagogue. And so we're not talking about, first off, how do you dispose of a synagogue? Can you dispose of a synagogue? Is a synagogue lose its status when people stop praying in it, right? So it's not necessarily the way we think of the shul. We know the shul is a special place. We know that we're supposed to have certain types of behavior, and we'll see that in how that's codified in Jewish law. But we have to kind of almost take the same thought process we have to holy objects and recognize that Jewish tradition places that on the synagogue. And the question is, how significantly? Is this a biblical mandate? Is this a rabbinic mandate? And how exactly does this guide us? Clearly, the temple, it can be a model, because we know the temple was a sacred space that only individuals who were ritually pure could enter. And therefore, it had a whole host of regulations and rules, and maybe can they be transferred over to the synagogue? And that's how we're going to get this analysis started. And so we see in the Mishnah in Megillah, source number 2, residents of a town who sold the town square, which was at times used for public prayer, and therefore attained a certain degree of sanctity, may use the proceeds of the sale only to purchase something of a greater degree of sanctity. They may therefore purchase a synagogue with the proceeds of the sale. If they sold a synagogue, they may purchase an ark in which to house sacred scrolls. If they sold an ark, they may purchase wrapping cloths for the sacred scrolls. If they sold wrapping cloths, they may purchase scrolls of the prophets and the writings. If they sold scrolls of the prophets and the writings, they may purchase a Torah scroll. We see this idea of ma'alin ba'kodesh, increasing in holiness, similar to the expression we use with the Hanukkah lights. We always go up, and that's the rationale for Hillel's view that the number of candles that we light goes up each night, which is the approach that we follow. We generally like to be moving in an upward fashion, increasing. So you don't sell the synagogue to buy a courtyard, you sell the courtyard to buy the synagogue. You don't sell the Torah scroll to buy a synagogue, you sell the synagogue to buy a Torah scroll. We're heading in that direction. We always want to be moving forward and not backward. So we see that there's a certain concept of synagogue in the hierarchy of holiness. Where does this holiness come from? So Rabbi Eliezer of Metz, a medieval Ashkenaz scholar, died in 1175. He had a book of Sefer Yireim, which is a book of laws. The verse, and you shall fear God, et mitashi tira'u, v'yaresam elokecha, ani Hashem. There's also a verse which says you shall have awe of your sanctity. We'll see that next. Is a commandment for a person to treat the temple or a synagogue or a study hall with reverence and honor. So we see this idea that we have reverence for God by having reverence for space where God is uttered, discussed, invoked. And Rabbi Eliezer of Metz says it's the same rule for the temple, the synagogue, and the study hall. All three are the same. And so we have this idea that he understands that this is a very significant rule. The same way we treat the temple, from that is how we learn how to treat the synagogue. Now, we'll see some of the expressions or examples of this rule in a minute. Well, we know that according to many opinions, the Temple Mount maintains its sanctity, even though there's no temple. Right? So, what about a synagogue? Is the synagogue something similar? Is it once a synagogue, always a synagogue? Is it always a sacred space? So I just want to go off into that direction for a minute. The Mishnah says later in that chapter, source 4, Rabbi Yehuda said further, a synagogue that fell into ruin still may not be used for a mundane purpose. There's some significance to that. The synagogue that falls into ruin, this space, it's holy soil, it's holy space. Now, this is the Mishnah. We all know the Mishnah presents the law without going into differentiations and exceptions. But I would imagine that many of us have seen places, grown up in places that had synagogues, that don't know that the synagogues fell out of use and Jews moved to a different neighborhood. What happens to those buildings? So, in particular, in mid-20th century urban America, this happened a lot in synagogues as there was a rush to the suburbs and some of the synagogues fell out of use. There was always a discussion, can you sell it to a church? Who can you sell it to? Can you tear it down? How does that work? So, obviously Jewish law doesn't end with this Mishnah's comment, and there's further discussions. And as you can imagine, there are different views. Just wanted to point out one extreme version of a synagogue that falls into ruin, that Rabbi Ovadia Yosef feels is so far removed from a synagogue that it's no longer in the same category as the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah essentially says, all things equal, synagogue's not used, it's still sacred space. Cannot be used for a mundane purpose. So Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is dealing with a situation. He was asked by a rabbi in Austria about a synagogue that had been used by the Nazis. And the question now came, well, what would the community do with the space? And so he has a longer discussion, and he talks about, and you see source number 5, about a synagogue in the diaspora that was taken over by, you see in the middle of the line, Hanatzim v'ozrehem harishayim yimach shemam v'zichram. It's taken over by the Nazis. And they destroy the inside of the synagogue. Right, so he says there, Harei nifka'a kedusha sam ligamri. It's completely lost its holiness. And even the land underneath that space is also gone, is no longer holy. And he talks about this idea about the fact that the rabbis talked about synagogues that have been destroyed. Right, the rabbis were talking kishecharvu me'atzmam, when they fell into disrepair. They, once upon a time, the buildings didn't last forever. They didn't have building codes and inspections. And when the rabbis talk about a synagogue falling into ruin, it meant literally it falls into ruin, not because someone did something to it. But, he says, the last full line, Nidon didan, shebo pritzim v'chilu mikdash mat v'chrivuhu, where people came, enemies of the Jews came and destroyed it. Einam bikdushas tam, it's no longer holy. And you're allowed to rent it or sell it or use it for another purpose. So that is this idea of the sanctity of the synagogue. And I introduced this here just to show the fact that on the one hand, the synagogue is as holy as the temple. That holiness can extend even if it's no longer used. It can maybe extend forever. But there, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef introduces the fact that all things are not equal. He's willing to look back at the rationale or the methods of construction then versus how it's used today. And imagining the fact that when the rabbis were talking about their sacred spaces, they weren't necessarily even envisioning what might happen to them or having to have secular purposes. Could they even envision a developer coming in and wanting to buy the synagogue for its air rights in order to build a skyscraper, which could then ensure that the congregation will be able to survive much further? Right, there are a couple of cases like that going on right now. One in particular, I think, where they built Margaritaville in Manhattan. There was a synagogue. I think it was a garment center synagogue that had an arrangement. The arrangement didn't work out. But in any event, these are all situations that Rav Yosef is pointing out. The rabbis were not talking about extreme cases. They're saying all things being equal, the synagogue has holiness, that holiness remains forever. And now we can look at the types of behavior that are required. But there is a little bit of a sliding scale that the way synagogues have been used or might be used or can be utilized and the way the Jewish community is situated may change some of how we interpret or apply these laws. So I'm going to stop for any questions or comments on just the introduction of those halachot or that case in particular before looking at the types of behavior that belong, that are appropriate. Suffice it to say, pickleball probably doesn't belong in a sanctuary. If you're waiting for that heter, you should drop off now. But we can still have much to talk about in terms of behavior in the synagogue.
Rabbi, what about bingo? What is your view on that?
So I think that bingo or other types of social activities, that's what we're going to come to in some of the next sources. In particular, source number 6, the Shulchan Aruch in chapter 151 of Orach Chaim has essentially lays out the appropriate behaviors and the inappropriate behaviors, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. Any other questions or reactions?
Medicare and most private insurance cover this procedure. Full motion, no pain, walking.
All right. So let's go to the Shulchan Aruch. Let's see how this is codified. One may not behave in a lightheaded manner in a synagogue or house of study, right? Beit Knesset or Beit Midrash. For example, laughter, humor, or pointless chatter, right? Rabbi shouldn't tell jokes, or maybe it depends on the joke, but there's a certain frivolity where it's supposed to be, as the rabbis say in the Talmud, that when we go in to pray, we should have it be in a more of a serious mindset. Koved rosh is the term used, heavy-headed, the idea that there should be some seriousness. One should not eat or drink. There should not, nor should one adorn oneself there or walk about there. Right? It's not a place for eating or drinking. It's not a place for walking around the aisles. One should not enter there in the summer due to the sun, nor in the winter to seek shelter from the rain. Right? It's not supposed to be a place of for utilitarian uses. Right? You're there to pray. You're there for holy purposes. Another couple of examples. No monetary calculation should be made there unless they are for the purpose of a mitzvah. For example, collecting money for charity or redemption of captives, right? Pidyon shvuyim. The idea of, so you shouldn't talk business, you shouldn't talk money, make calculations unless it's about tzedakah. Right, that created the whole culture in synagogues of schnuttering, as it was called, right? The fact that after people would receive their aliyah to the Torah, a prayer would be made on their behalf and on behalf of their families, and in return, they would ba'avur shenadar ma'ot lebeit hakneset. They would donate money to the shul. So the word shenadar turned into schnuttering, and this turned into a whole unwelcome experience for many, and it led to the rise of the Young Israel movement was an attempt to streamline the Torah reading and avoid all of these mishaberachs and all of the schnuttering. But it's okay because you're supposed to talk about charity in the shul. Now here's one: no eulogy should be delivered there unless it is for one of the leaders of the city, for all the people assemble there to eulogize him. Right? You shouldn't be using shuls for funerals unless it is for a leader, because in that case, everybody assembles, right? This gets us back to the whole idea of Beit Knesset is a space of assembly. And so therefore, when everyone is coming, maybe that leads it to be a holy purpose. I will have to unpack that a little bit more. I would imagine many of us have either heard of or been to funerals in synagogues. Often these are people some shuls actually have rules that only the rabbi or officers or the past presidents can have funerals there. I know in my experiences, generally, people who, the operative phrase here is that when people assemble, when too many people are coming to have the funeral in other places, right? Some of the funeral chapels are too small. If you have 1,000 people at a funeral or 2,000 people at a funeral, depending on the size. So if you need the synagogue for that type of a purpose, so it says none unless it's part of the people assembling. If one must enter there for his own needs, for example, to call someone, he should enter and read a little or study something and then call him, so that it should not appear as if he entered on his own needs. The idea that, let's say you're looking for someone, you want to go in and get them, you shouldn't just go in and get them. You should say a little prayer or study a verse of Torah. This is the same idea that they talk about a little bit more familiar rule that you shouldn't use a synagogue as a shortcut, right? So like, picture that, the whole thing, it's raining outside or the like. You shouldn't cut through the shul to avoid walking in the rain. If you're going to cut through the shul, you have to at least turn it into a bit of a religious experience. For the needs of the synagogue, and here's where we begin to veer off, for the needs of the synagogue, one may eat and sleep in it. So we see an exception. Specifically, the exception that is recorded in the Shulchan Aruch here is for this reason: one may sleep in a synagogue the night of Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is a day that you're not really celebrating any other Yom Tov type experience other than prayer, since you're fasting. So to enable more time spent in shul, you can sleep in the shul on Yom Kippur. And even for the needs of another mitzvah. For example, when people gather to make a leap year in the synagogue, it would be permissible to eat there. So he's talking about when the calendar would have been calculated by people and not necessarily getting your calendar from the shul or from the funeral chapel, where most of the calendars today come from, or printed from. If they needed to have a serious conversation that would take a long time, require deliberation. It's a long meeting, you can serve food and drink so that the people would be able to accomplish their business. So these are the exceptions. These are the rules and these are the exceptions. On the one hand, you can't do anything there. On the other, well, if it turns into a religious purpose, well then, it's not called making the shul a shortcut if you do something religious there. Or if there's a need, sleeping or eating does become permissible. So there's a very serious ruling that is presented. At the same time, there are a couple of openings that are there that may lead to certain exceptions. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik pointed out that the rules of the shul are significant. There's the idea of respecting the shul, but he says it doesn't rise to the same level of reverence for the temple. He takes an approach that's very different from the Sefer Yereim that we saw earlier. He doesn't think that that's the normative accepted practice. We don't have to have the same reverence for the temple as we do for the synagogue. We don't have the same rules of purity. He feels that if we're talking about respect for the synagogue, there's certain, it's more rabbinic. There is some more flexibility. And we'll see in a minute how some of that flexibility is introduced, and even how flexibility may be introduced. If you want to say the sanctity of the synagogue and the temple are at the same level, there could be a big but, or a major exception that we will introduce in a minute. Questions or comments on the list of behaviors that are prohibited for the synagogue, or when some of the exceptions might be made? So I think it should also be noted that I've always wondered whether this rule was for the synagogue structure or the sanctuary. And in my approach, the sanctuary would seem to be a space that all of chapter 151 of Shulchan Aruch could apply. The other spaces could be viewed a little differently. And I think that this can connect to the fact that there were the structures of the sages were generally much simpler than ours today. They didn't have synagogue centers that had other rooms. And so I've always wondered whether we could say that it's the sanctuary that shouldn't have these things. The sanctuary should have no eating or drinking unless there's a mitzvah purpose to it. And I've always felt that. It seems that even as you move the halachic conversation forward into times where there were larger synagogues with multiple spaces, there does seem to be this idea that the sanctity from the sanctuary may extend to the rest of the structure. But that's just one way that I feel does exist within the language of the rules, right? Your rabbi's office is not part of the shul. It's in the shul building, but it's not the same. No, of course, a rabbi's office is the Holy of Holies. But there's still this idea that I feel that the conversation starts with, just the temple was essentially, the holiest parts of the temple were sacred space. And, we had the rabbis of the Sanhedrin sitting, that was part of the complex, but it wasn't at the same level with the different gradations of sanctity and purity required. But I do think that the at least the way the Talmudic and halachic conversation starts, we're talking about the entire structure has these rules. But in source number 7, we enter the big but. Rav Asi said, this is the Talmud Megillah, synagogues in Babylonia are built from the outset with a stipulation that they not have the full sanctity of a synagogue in order that it be permitted to use them for the community's general needs. But nevertheless, one should not act inside them with frivolity, right? So you have kind of a major exception. He says that the synagogues in Babylonia, they're built with a stipulation. This is called a tanai, right? Al tanai. I'm building the shul to be a holy shul with a stipulation that it could also be used for other purposes. And in Rav Asi's presentation, it's a stipulation that doesn't have to be stipulated. It's almost by definition that these synagogues are going to be used for other purposes. Maybe it's recognizing the characteristics of the Babylonian, the diaspora community. maybe without the synagogues that developed outside of Israel developed without a temple-centric system, and therefore they always had to take on different purposes. But that's how Rav Asi presents it. The synagogues are al tanai, whether it's articulated or maybe even if it's not articulated. It's almost kind of like a giant fingers crossed. It's a shul with all the rules of the shul, except when we need to use it for things that are not for the uses of a shul. And this is what Rav Asi introduces. The Shulchan Aruch, later in chapter 151, presents this Rav Asi statement as law, but with a major distinction. If at a time of building the synagogue, they made a condition, right? So the Shulchan Aruch wants there to be a specific condition. To be able to use it for mundane purposes, it is permitted to use it after it is destroyed. But while it is in use, the condition is ineffective. Even when it's destroyed, to use it for a disgraceful purpose like planting or financial calculations for the people, the condition is ineffective, right? This takes us back to what we saw earlier about the fact that a synagogue in its ruin cannot be used for mundane purposes. So that here the Shulchan Aruch says Rav Asi the condition of Rav Asi only works when the shul is no longer in use. It makes it easier to sell, tear down, repurpose the synagogue space, structure, real estate once it's not being used. But according to the way the Shulchan Aruch presents this, there's according to the way the Shulchan Aruch presents this, the Tanai doesn't work. And therefore, the way the Shulchan Aruch understands is that the synagogue has to only be used for its appropriate purposes and does not have that same flexibility. Now, it seems like common practice in the Jewish community doesn't follow this specific view. So in fact, the commentaries of the Shulchan Aruch, including the Mishnah Berurah, point out that there are that the Shulchan Aruch is following one view of the understanding of the Talmud, but there's another view of the understanding of the Talmud formulated by the Ramban, right? Not Maimonides, but Nachmanides, who's writing in the late 12th, 13th century. That no, Rabbi Asi's comment applies even when the shul is built. So Shulchan Aruch follows this lane, others follow the Ramban lane, and see Rabbi Asi's conditional approach as normative, even for a built-in structure. And I think that that's very much how people have looked at the synagogue. It talks about not eating or drinking in the synagogue. I don't know in your experience. In general, we don't want food or drink. We want people to daven. We don't want anything to spill on the pews or the carpet or anything like that. But there seems to have developed, especially based on this Rabbi Asi, as following the Ramban path of familiarity in the synagogue. And I especially noticed this among Sephardim. And if you've ever davened a Sephardic shul, it's not uncommon to have the people come in with a cup of coffee. In fact, sometimes they have coffee set up in the back of the shul, right outside the shul, and it's almost kind of encouraged. It was kind of interesting. I was in Mexico City for not this past Shabbos, but the Shabbos before, Ashkenaz shul, but there's more of an influx of Sephardic members. And right outside the doors of the shul is a coffee urn, and people are coming in and they have their cup of coffee. And in fact, even the rabbi on his stender, his lectern, has a cup of coffee there. That's on the one hand, we want to make ourselves familiar in the synagogue. At the same time, that's very different from this sanctity of the synagogue as presented by in the Talmud, as understood by Jewish tradition as, right. You don't kind of walk in to see the President of the United States with a cup of coffee in your hand, right? Unless you're Jerry Seinfeld, having comedians in cars with coffee with in that episode. But at the same time, there's a certain familiarity, and there does seem to be a different understanding of the purpose of the shul in the diaspora, as understood, as introduced by Rav Asi, and the path that we follow of the Ramban. And so the Shulchan Aruch takes a more narrow understanding, and we're going to see that this has a bit of has a broader understanding. Questions, comments before we see how that broader understanding gets articulated in Jewish law.
Rabbi, we use the social hall on holidays for services, as many other synagogues, we use the tent. Do they take on the characteristic of a sanctuary because
So-
we have a Torah there and we daven there,
Right,
or
you know,
we only?
so it's interesting. I would say kind of the idea of a portable or temporary synagogue it wasn't fully envisioned by our sages the way we're introducing the sanctity of the synagogue. Right, remember, they're basing it on the temple, which was a major project and it had its rules and regulations. The synagogue gets used as an assembly space, as a gathering space, as a prayer space, and we're not sure what to do with it. So we kind of attach it to the sanctity of the temple, and then it starts coming down to us in contemporary practice. Either in a very narrow sense, it has to be as holy as the temple, or maybe especially as introduced in the diaspora in a more expanded sense. And I would say probably Israeli synagogues today are more like diaspora synagogues in this respect. But there's very little way of understanding this temporary synagogue. In general, the halacha isn't so comfortable with this temporary synagogue. They talk about, for example, when can you move a Torah from a shul? This comes up when people want to have a shiva minyan in the home, and there's some discussion that only if you're going to read from the Torah 3 times should you move the Torah from the synagogue. There's a certain desirability of permanence when it comes to prayer spaces. And the temporary accommodations, which are made because you need the space, they're kind of ad hoc. So I think that a place where you're davening, when you're davening, there requires synagogue sanctity, but I don't think you can go as far as say that it acquires the same level of sanctity. It's clearly being used on a temporary basis. A social hall, which is part of a synagogue structure, may have the same rules of a shul. You know, as we said, it's unclear. You know, it seems that the halachot of the synagogue are talking about the entire structure and not just the sanctuary space. And I think the major exception, the fact that contemporary synagogues or synagogues of the last several hundred years were used for multiple purposes, and you have kiddush in the shul and shalshudis in the shul and activities in the shul and bingo in the shul and maybe pickleball in the shul, comes from this approach that starts with Rabbi Asi in the Talmud, as understood in the more lenient approach that there's an implicit stipulation that can be applied to the synagogue structure, even when it's built in the diaspora, and therefore that will lead some contemporary authorities to permit, allow, and maybe even encourage other activities in the synagogue structure. But those temporary spaces don't have the same rules. Yes.
Some years ago, Linda performed in Fiddler on the Roof in a conservative synagogue in Far Rockaway. Would there be any problem with doing that in our shul?
Look, based on what we're seeing so far, if we take the more expansive view of Rabbi Asi, you can do other things in the shul as long as it's not, as long as it doesn't, as long as they're permitted activities. But let's look at, so essentially we've grown accustomed to synagogues being used for other purposes, whether they be conservative synagogues or Orthodox synagogues. We've seen them be used for other services. Some people are more restrictive in how they're used and prefer synagogues not be used for these other purposes, while some are more expansive and permitted. Sometimes it's a matter of space, sometimes it's a matter of necessity, sometimes it's a matter of preference. But just to look at some of the precedents that take us from Rabbi Asi's comment about synagogues being used for ordinary purposes in the diaspora because of the stipulation. And even while they're constructed, remember, Shulchan Aruch only feels this can apply once the synagogue is not being used anymore. But even when the synagogue remains in use, to use it for other purposes besides holy purposes. So Rabbi Chaim Halberstam was a Hasidic rabbi and community rabbi, a well-known posek, decisive Jewish law, right, active in the 19th century. And he essentially was so often approached to explain the halachic justification for some of the Hasidic practices. Right? The Hasidim were not breaking Jewish law, but they were deviating sometimes from the accepted practice. So he was asked about the fact that, the Rebbes had tishas in the shul, and they had shalshudises in the shul, and they had farbrengens in the shul, and there was lachayims in the shul. And so how does this work? So he says that in source number 9, the bate midrashim shel tzadike hador, right? The tzadikim, that they do not set them up. Ein lahem din beit hamidrash liot lo kedushas beis hakneses. They were never built like the standard beis medrash that's viewed as a beis knesses, that's viewed as a synagogue that has the holiness, the sanctity of that space. Sharayanu roim shemisham shebo dvarim shein risham misham shmeis hamidrash stam afilai de tanai. Right? They do activities there that some would not even permit in accordance with Rabbi Asi's conditional holiness. Shalashudas, they make sudas nesuin, they have weddings there. V'sochakim b'simchas mitzvah, they have celebrations there, right? This may, when we talk about frivolous behavior, we may think of lewd or secular behavior, but look, the Shulchan Aruch says you're not allowed to laugh in a shul. So there's kind of a bit of a fine line that sometimes appropriate activity may still not qualify for the sacred space, but these Hasidic groups, the Rebbes, do use them like that. People, he said, they would sleep in the beis medrash, and it doesn't make any sense. So this is now in the middle of the paragraph in the bold. Achatam de tzadikim bonim rak l'shem beis vad l'talmidei chachamim lihikahel yachad. They're not building shuls, they're not building study halls, they're not building the classic beis knesses or beis medrash. They're building a beis vad. A vad is place of assembly. They're building assembly spaces. And that's where they had, and you could have all the joy and all the celebration, all the appropriate activities, physical, non-sacred activities, and they don't have the Kedushas Beis HaKnesses Aleichem. And he says, I heard this explicitly from one tzaddik, that he says at the time of the building, he says that he's making conditional, he says it out loud, Shabona Beis Vad. I am building an assembly space. I'm not building a sacred synagogue study hall space. Ubezeh bevada rashai li shamesh, the last 2 lines, afilu ba'odo kayam. You can use it, therefore, for all these purposes, even when you're also using it for synagogue or a study hall, because it's not considered a synagogue at all. So, so if you want to have the lollipops for the kids, as Hirsch comments, we don't have shuls anymore. We don't have classic Beit Knesset in the formal sense. We have assembly spaces. Maybe Shearith Israel is a little bit different. And something tells me it's much more cultural than explicitly halachic in the construction of a Shearith Israel. It's more the culture of a place than this type of a discussion. But we see that in understanding the Hasidic uses of the what we would call the shuls, we see we see a precedent for our type of shuls as well. And fast forward, a little, a later contemporary, a younger contemporary of Divrei Chaim, Rabbi Yechiel Michal Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan, and he also addresses this. And one can question the current practice being lenient about speaking in the synagogue or Beit Midrash, following prayers about all matters of Monday topic. Well, he's not even talking about food; he's talking about talking. But halavai, we all daven in shuls that talking was viewed as an offense that is noticeable, as opposed to the talking that generally takes place. It appears to me that they base themselves on the position of Ramban, who explains that synagogues in the diaspora are built on condition that even while they're in operation as synagogues, they can be used for other needed purposes. And we think mundane conversations are needed, right? I just have to tell you what's on my mind right now. Each individual decides for himself. However, it's certainly forbidden to smoke bitter leaves. Right? He's talking now about smoking, the way that tobacco that leads to lightheadedness, or maybe the contemporary application would be marijuana. It's only permissible. They talk about how people could smoke in the shul, and he tries to find a way of justifying that behavior for those who just smoke all day anyway. But he starts off by saying a lot of this, each individual decides for himself what's considered necessary behavior. And we have, again, Rabbi Asi says the synagogues are built on condition. Shulchan Aruch seems to say that's only when they're no longer in use, following that approach, the more restrictive approach. From the Ramban, we have a more expansive approach, that this condition can work even when synagogues are in use, and we see this justification employed by the Divrei Chaim describing Hasidic communities, and the Aruch HaShulchan describing the situation in his time. Questions or comments before we just look at the idea of what about getting married in a shul? Because that would seem to be one area that there remains some tension and some discussion. Questions or comments?
Post
Rabbi,
Yom
one thing, okay, so,
Kippur War, my father-in-law had throngs of people at his shul, which was Temple Hillel. But to maintain it, you had to give food like midnight bagels and lox after slichot. I miss that.
Right. Oh, food has become an inducement for some. I think, these days a shorter service seems to be an inducement for others. More than the food, people will go home and eat. But again, we see that this type of use of the synagogue, which you're describing, which Kaplan saw as the synagogue center, the shul with the pool, there's a history of it. Even though we start with the synagogue being viewed as sacred space like the temple, there is this Talmudic exception in the diaspora, and understood more expansively through the Ramban. We see that this was used as justification for practices for the last several hundred years for synagogues having a more expanded utility.
Rabbi, I've been to small shuls that after Shabbos services reset up the same room where you daven for the kiddush, and
Right.
laughing and talking and drinking and eating.
Right. So that clearly is relying upon this, this more expanded exception lane of the Ramban, from the Talmud through the Ramban and through others. It just seems that that again, like I said a few minutes ago, that while our sages talk about the sanctity of the synagogue and we appreciate the sanctity of the synagogue, there's been a need over the generations, and maybe more so in particular over the last several hundred years, to expand the use of the synagogue for other purposes, to engage the broader spiritual needs of the population. And specifically, we see that invoked by the Divrei Chaim and by the Aruch HaShulchan. And and certainly when you have a need for space, even more so. Yeah.
at 1:30, there's going to be Barbara Streisand leading a celebration for survivors with many stars on Zoom, 1:30. Also,
Is it in
Rabbi,
shul?
huh?
I love it to be in shul. That'd be a good draw.
I have a question, Rabbi. What's the connection between the food, halava, and halavaya?
I think it's kind of, I think, halava, you should limit your halava intake. It's hard because it's so tasty, but halava, go easy on the halava.
Probably connected. I think those two words have to have a connection.
All right, any other questions? So let's just look at the wedding situation, because the idea of having a wedding in a shul, we've all been to weddings at shuls. It's part of it, a discussion as to where's the ideal place for a chuppah. And a tradition developed to have a chuppah under the stars, under the heavens. It's not an explicit requirement, but the idea developed. Rabbi Moshe Isserlis makes mention of it in the laws of the wedding. Part of it is also where do you have the space to have them? And so in the 19th century, this became a point of contention because this was the time when some of the community, especially Central Western European community in Germany, Hungary, started to reform traditional Jewish practice. Right, the rise of the Reform, the beginning of the Enlightenment, and in reaction to that, whatever those more progressive or reforming Jews were doing, the Orthodox forbade. Right, classic example is the sermon. The more progressive rabbis would speak in German, so it became forbidden to have a sermon in German. And we know how that has transpired over time, right? For a good big chunk of time, the idea of the shul being a place only for Jewish language, but that Jewish language was Yiddish. So the kind of, the whole idea of not speaking the vernacular was really in opposition to those who were changing traditional Judaism. So Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch summarizes the issue, the more prohibitive side of the issue, with regards to having a shul, wedding in a shul. Right? He says that this practice, michukos hagoy, is an embarrassment to the shul to follow in this Gentile practice of getting married in a sanctuary. Right? The idea was feeling that the synagogues were turning into, they wanted them to be more Christian in nature. What did that mean? Well, back then it meant families sitting together. Back then it meant actually decorum, that everyone was quiet. It meant that the reader faced the congregation, and it was used for similar purposes. People got married in churches, so why can't they get married in synagogues? Or they even idealized getting married in synagogues because that was viewed as a dignified place. So the reaction to that was, oh, they did it because the non-Jews do it, so therefore it can't be done by the Jews. That's how Rabbi Sternbuch introduces it. You can do it outside the shul, even though that's still part of the geography. It's part of the compound. And he says, he says that if there are, the Jewish wedding ceremony has to be witnessed by two valid, religiously valid witnesses. So he wants to raise the possibility that if there are two people who will attend this chuppah, they're not religiously valid because they're sinful in going to have a wedding there. But then he says, no, it's okay. Maybe they're just making a mistake. They think that it's okay. So he's not going to say that the whole kiddushin, the whole Jewish marriage falls apart. And there are those who say that there are rabbis who do this, but they do this because their lay people force them to do it and they have no choice. And this is not something you have to give your life for. So therefore, you don't have to give up your parnasa, your job for this. We don't want to talk more about this. And then he says, because of our sins in the diaspora, they do chuppah in the shuls, and we can't stop them because they don't appreciate that there is something forbidden in this. But he says, and this is 3 lines from the bottom, you shouldn't go. Because you're therefore adding your approbation to this. I never participated. Maybe that, someone who just goes and he's not necessarily, adding to the celebration, he's not justifying it, maybe it's okay, but he says a Talmud Chacham, if someone who's a knowledgeable Jew goes, people will think it's okay, you shouldn't go at all. There's a Chil Hashem. Okay, that's the more restrictive approach. But he does point out that it was the ways of the non-Jews. So again, the Reform Jews did it to make the shuls more in line with the way the churches were. This is viewed as a violation. This is viewed now as completely prohibited. You shouldn't go. You shouldn't attend. We want to raise the possibility that a wedding that takes place is not considered a valid wedding. Okay, so Rabbi Moshe Feinstein has a little bit more of a more accepting view. He's not a huge fan, but he's more accepting. So this is source number 12. He's asked, is there a prohibition to get married there, or is it better not to go there? And so he says the fact that they have shuls in weddings, weddings in shuls and not outside, like the Rambam mentions, right? Can the rabbi go there to officiate? Or, if he doesn't go, maybe he'll lose his job. And he says, this is the third line in the middle, Pashot uvarur, shaf b'lo chashash yisalku, lo rak sharashai lelech, el af shemechuyev lelech, ki olav mutal l'rosh kedushin kedin haTorah. He says, not only should you go, you have to go. They need someone to officiate, and they need a rabbi. You have to go make sure that the ceremony is done properly, right? You have to go. It's your responsibility as a rabbi of the community. And he says that's what rabbis and major, big rabbis and prominent rabbis in New York have done. It's also, to draw them closer and to maintain a connection. And then he quotes the restrictive view in the middle of Chasam Sofer. He says it was only prohibited. You're worried about following the ways of non-Jews. But he didn't say the practice is forbidden. It was about what they were doing, right? You should stay away from this and the like, right? And it's not saying, this is not the language of prohibition, but this is something that shouldn't be done because of the behavior that they were taking. Right, and he says 3 lines on the bottom. Lo kasav zeh chasam sofer el bimkomo. It was only in that place that the wicked reformer Jews were trying to uproot all of the customs and practices and rules of the Torah. Right, and it's not prohibited, and therefore, as he says, wait, it's clearly that our weddings and they take place are not mimicking the weddings of non-Jews. Our synagogues are not like the churches, as he says at the end. We don't daven the same way. We daven to the one God. We daven the Jewish davening. It's not the same thing. So Rabbi Feinstein, while cognizant of maybe the preferable for the chuppah to take place outside of a synagogue, recognizes that it's not prohibited and certainly is something that is permissible and possible, and no reason to avoid if it means if you're needed to officiate at that wedding. And so it seems that this last purpose, is not a secular purpose. It's a mitzvah to get married and a mitzvah to have a kedushin. But it did emerge that there's this pushback from we don't want our shuls to become too secularized or desacralized. We want them to maintain their sanctity, and you have to walk that fine line, that balance. Between how the shul is meant to be and how it should be used. But we see that there is a long history. It wasn't just Mordechai Kaplan who saw the synagogue as having an expanded purpose for people for not just prayer purposes, but while the rabbis initially, Talmudic era, early the medieval era, may have had a more narrow view for what the synagogue could be used for, certainly that opinion that appears in the Talmud of Rabbi Asi about the diaspora shul being conditional, as it's understood by the Ramban, takes us to the more expanded use of the synagogue, and when it became necessary, and certainly when it became popular in the times of the Hasidim and going forward, to have the shul with the shal shudis or the pool or the bingo, there does seem to be room to allow it. When introducing that, even a religious activity to the shul that may deviate from tradition or drive Jews in the wrong direction, we see opposition comes up even to using it for a mitzvah purpose. So this kind of the society and societal needs, expectations, culture plays a role in this as well. I guess if pickleball becomes a desire or something that will bring people into the shul, then it's not totally forward to think about that as a possibility as well. And I think that we see a little bit of an extension to our discussion last week about outdoor lightings. We saw how the role of the shul was there utilized as a precedent from the Rabbi Binyamin Zilber to facilitate lightings of Hanukkah lights all over at parties, outdoors, and the like. The fact that the synagogue occupied space not just as reminding us of the temple or being a place for prayers, but also a place for where the Jews were gathering. And when we have Jews gathering, that can be turned into a sacred purpose and extended into the Hanukkah season. And bringing the Jews in will hopefully into the shul, hopefully into a positive environment, does wonders not only for their bodies or their stomachs, but also for their souls.